The human mind possesses a remarkable capacity to compartmentalize the weight of a revolution until the body itself begins to fracture under the strain. We often mistake the intensity of a public persona for an infinite well of vitality, assuming that those who speak the loudest are the most resilient against the physical toll of their own existence. But beneath the defiant gaze and the poetic fury of a man who became the voice of a generation, there was a quiet, escalating war being waged against his own mortality. On September 13, 1996, at University Medical Center in Las Vegas, Nevada, that war reached a silent, clinical conclusion. The room was not filled with the chaotic energy of the streets or the rhythmic pulse of a recording studio. It was defined by the rhythmic hiss of a ventilator and the final, heavy stillness of a man who had spent his final 6 days suspended between worlds. The discovery of his ultimate fate did not come through a sudden burst of violence in that hospital room, but through the gradual cooling of a body that had survived 4 gunshot wounds, only to succumb to the invisible cascades of internal failure. There is a persistent cloud of myth that surrounds the end of this life, a fog of conspiracy and rumor that has obscured the biological reality of what happened. To understand the man, we must look past the icon, moving away from the whispers of the street and into the sterile clarity of the examination table. This is the medical truth of a life lived at a terminal velocity, revealed not through gossip, but through the silent testimony of the autopsy. To understand the physical collapse of Tupac Amaru Shakur, one must first understand the biological inheritance of stress. He was born into a state of high alert, a child of the Black Panther movement whose very gestation occurred while his mother, Afeni Shakur, was incarcerated and fighting for her own life in a court of law. This was not a childhood of stability. It was a formative period defined by the physiological effects of chronic cortisol. From his earliest days in East Harlem and later Baltimore, the young Shakur was a sensitive instrument tuned to a high frequency. Those who knew him as a teenager saw a boy who was deeply empathetic, an artist who found refuge in the theater and the works of Shakespeare, yet he was constantly navigating a world that demanded a harder exterior. This duality, the intellectual poet versus the product of a volatile environment, created a psychological friction that would define his entire adult life. He was a man of immense discipline, often spending 20 hours a day in the studio, driven by an obsessive need to document his thoughts before time ran out. This was not merely work ethic. It was a frantic, almost prophetic race against a clock only he could hear. As his fame exploded in the early 1990s, the pressure of being a cultural lightning rod began to manifest in his physical presence. Tupac was often described as high-strung, a term that downplays the reality of a nervous system stuck in a permanent fight-or-flight response. He suffered from bouts of insomnia and a relentless intensity that made relaxation impossible. This was a man who felt the weight of his community on his shoulders, a burden that carries a documented medical cost. He was lean, almost slight, yet he carried himself with a gravitational pull that suggested a much larger physical frame. However, the cracks were starting to show long before the final events in Las Vegas. The emotional trauma of his upbringing, combined with the constant threat of litigation and the very real danger of his environment, meant that his body was never truly at rest. He spoke frequently of his own death, not as a poetic trope, but as a statistical probability. This preoccupation with his end wasn't just a lyrical theme. It was a reflection of a psyche that had been conditioned by trauma to expect a short lifespan. His time in prison further complicated his physical and mental health. The isolation and the sudden halt of his hyperproductive lifestyle led to periods of deep depression and hypervigilance. When he was released and signed to Death Row Records, the pace of his life didn't just resume, it accelerated to a dangerous degree. He was recording hundreds of tracks, filming movies, and navigating the deadliest corporate environment in the music industry. He was burning his candle at both ends, fueled by a sense of urgency that bordered on the manic. He rarely ate properly, he smoked incessantly, and he lived in a state of perpetual high-stakes conflict. While the world saw a superstar at the height of his powers, a medical perspective reveals a man whose adrenal system was likely exhausted. He was a perfectionist who could not tolerate failure in himself or others, a trait that brought him immense success but also left him isolated. There was a profound loneliness in his pursuit of greatness, a sense that he was misunderstood even by those closest to him. This psychological landscape is crucial to understanding why his body reacted the way it did when it was finally pushed to the breaking point. Tupac was not just a victim of a shooting. He was a man whose biological reserves had been depleted by years of intense stress and untreated trauma. The image of the thug was a mask that required an immense amount of energy to maintain, a mask that often contradicted his inherently sensitive and artistic nature. This internal conflict, the struggle between who he was and who the world required him to be, created a physiological environment of constant inflammation. By the time he arrived in Las Vegas in September 1996, he was a man on the edge, his body and mind stretched to their absolute limits. He was living on borrowed time, not just because of the threats against his life, but because the pace at which he lived was fundamentally unsustainable for the human frame. The shadow of what was to come was already visible in the weariness behind his eyes, a fatigue that no amount of success could mask. Something was fundamentally wrong beneath the surface, a hidden vulnerability that would soon be laid bare in the most tragic way possible. The physical decline of Tupac Shakur was not a slow erosion, but a series of violent punctuations that tested the limits of human endurance. To understand the state of his body in 1996, one must look back to November 30th, 1994, at Quad Recording Studios in Manhattan. This was the first time the world saw the physical vulnerability of a man who seemed invincible. Shot 5 times, including a graze to the head and a wound to the groin, Tupac's survival was hailed as miraculous. However, the medical reality of surviving such trauma is never a simple recovery. The physiological impact of multiple high-velocity projectile wounds includes long-term nerve damage, the formation of scar tissue, and a permanent shift in the body's pain threshold. He checked himself out of the hospital against medical advice a mere 3 hours after surgery, a decision driven by paranoia and an almost pathological distrust of the environment around him. This refusal to heal in a controlled setting meant his body was forced to knit itself back together while he was under the crushing weight of a high-profile trial and subsequent imprisonment. By the time he was released from Clinton Correctional Facility in late 1995, his physical state had been altered by the rigors of incarceration and the unaddressed trauma of the New York shooting. Those who worked with him at Death Row Records noticed a change in his physical energy. It was no longer the exuberant vitality of a young artist, but a desperate kinetic frenzy. He was visibly thinner, his features more angular, his eyes often carrying the glazed look of profound exhaustion. The thug life persona required a constant physical readiness, a tension held in the muscles and the jaw that never truly dissipated. He was living on a diet of Hennessy, cigarettes and studio food, neglecting the basic biological requirements of a body that had already sustained significant internal damage. This period was marked by a dangerous reliance on adrenaline to bypass the signals of pain and fatigue that his body was desperately sending. The chronic pain from his previous injuries was a silent passenger. In the medical community, we understand that trauma of this magnitude often leads to a heightened state of allodynia, where the nervous system remains in a state of hyperreactivity. For Tupac, this manifested as an inability to remain still and a heightened sensitivity to his surroundings. He was often described as being on fire, moving from the recording booth to movie sets with zero downtime. This was not just a professional choice, it was a coping mechanism. If he stopped moving, the weight of his physical and mental exhaustion would catch up to him. There were reported incidents of near collapses and moments where his voice, usually so resonant and powerful, would rasp with a fatigue that suggested his respiratory system was under significant strain. He was pushed to the brink by a schedule that would have broken a man in perfect health, let alone one carrying the hidden scars of 5 bullet wounds. In the months leading up to September 1996, his behavior became increasingly erratic, a classic sign of a psyche and a body reaching their breaking point. The isolation of fame had turned into a literal siege mentality. He was surrounded by a security detail that felt more like a paramilitary force, yet he often felt the most vulnerable. This psychological isolation has direct medical consequences, including suppressed immune function and increased cardiovascular strain. The events of the final weeks were a crescendo of this instability. He was involved in frequent altercations, his temper becoming a hair trigger. From a clinical perspective, this is often indicative of impulse control fatigue, where the brain's prefrontal cortex, exhausted by stress and lack of sleep, loses its ability to regulate emotional responses. He was a man whose biological brakes had failed, hurtling toward an inevitable impact. The night of September 7, 1996 in Las Vegas began with a physical altercation. In the lobby of the MGM, video footage shows Tupac leading the charge, his body leaning forward, fueled by a surge of dopamine and adrenaline. This was the final tax on his system. When the white Cadillac pulled up alongside the BMW 750IL at the intersection of Flamingo Road and Koval Lane, his body was already in a state of peak physiological arousal. As the rounds from the .40 caliber Glock struck him, the trauma was catastrophic. 4 bullets entered his frame, 1 in the arm, 1 in the thigh, and 2 in the chest, with 1 crucially piercing his right lung. This was not a survivable injury in the traditional sense. It was a total systemic insult. Upon arrival at University Medical Center, the clinical battle began. His body was pushed into a state of hypovolemic shock, a condition where severe blood loss makes it impossible for the heart to pump enough blood to the body. Surgeons acted with frantic precision, performing an emergency lobectomy to remove his perforated right lung in an attempt to stop the massive internal hemorrhaging. He was placed into a medically induced coma, a state designed to allow the body to divert all its remaining energy towards survival. For 6 days, the machines did the work his body no longer could. The medical staff noted that his heart stopped multiple times, requiring resuscitation. Each time he was brought back, his reserves grew thinner. The myth suggests he was fighting, and in a biological sense, he was, his heart, though damaged, continued to beat against the odds. But the damage to his pulmonary system and the massive blood loss had initiated a cascade of organ failure that even the most advanced medicine of the time could not reverse. The man who had survived, so much was finally being claimed by the physics of his injuries, his body surrendering in the quiet, sterilized air of the ICU, far from the roar of the crowd or the heat of the streets. The finality of September 13, 1996, arrived not with a scream, but with the rhythmic, mechanical sigh of a ventilator being silenced. At 4:03 p.m., after 6 days of grueling medical intervention, Tupac Shakur was pronounced dead. The transition from a living, breathing cultural force to a subject of forensic inquiry is a cold, clinical process. His body was transported to the Clark County Medical Examiner's office, where the transition from PAC to case number 9603748 began. The atmosphere of an autopsy suite is one of profound detachment. The emotions of the world outside are barred at the door to allow for the objective recording of trauma. The examination was conducted by Dr. Ed Brown, who sought to translate the violence of the streets into the precise language of pathology. The autopsy revealed a body that was a map of both recent and historical trauma. The external examination noted the surgical incisions, from the frantic attempts to save his life, including the thoracotomy scar where his right lung had been removed. The path of the fatal bullets was meticulously traced. One bullet had entered the right chest, causing catastrophic damage to the internal architecture of his thoracic cavity. It had perforated the lung, leading to massive hemothorax, a collection of blood in the space between the chest wall and the lung, which had effectively drowned his internal systems. Another projectile was recovered from the pelvic area. These were not mere flesh wounds, they were structural failures. The toxicology report, a standard part of any high-profile death investigation, was remarkably clear of the substances that often fuel the rumors surrounding celebrity deaths. While there were traces of the sedatives used by the hospital to maintain his medically induced coma, the primary finding was a lack of illegal narcotics or extreme alcohol levels at the time of the shooting. This was a man who died not of an overdose or a lifestyle of excess, but of ballistic trauma and the resulting systemic shock. The medical examiner ruled the cause of death as respiratory failure and cardiopulmonary arrest resulting from multiple gunshot wounds. This clinical verdict stands in sharp contrast to the labyrinthine conspiracy theories that have flourished in the decades since. Rumors of a fake death, of a secret life in another country, or of a body double are dismantled by the physical evidence found on the table. The autopsy confirmed his identity through dental records and the unique tapestry of tattoos that adorned his skin, each one a permanent record of his beliefs and his journey. The internal examination also noted the state of his remaining organs, which showed the signs of a man who had lived under immense stress, but was otherwise physically resilient. There was no evidence of a secret illness or a hidden terminal diagnosis. His body was that of a 25-year-old male in the prime of his life, albeit one whose physiological reserves had been pushed to their absolute limit. The removal of the right lung is a critical detail often overlooked in the sensationalized accounts of his final days. In the medical world, a single lung patient can survive and lead a productive life, but the immediate post-operative period is fraught with danger. The remaining left lung must compensate for the loss, and in a state of hypovolemic shock, the heart is forced to work twice as hard to oxygenate the blood. Tupac's heart, though strong, could not sustain the necessary output to keep his brain and other vital organs alive under such depleted conditions. His death was a gradual systemic collapse, a biological surrender that occurred despite the best efforts of modern trauma surgery. The investigation into his death was not just a police matter. It was a medical autopsy of a society's violence, reflected in the shattered ribs and punctured vessels of one of its most prominent voices. As the formal investigation concluded, the body was released for cremation, a decision that fueled further speculation, but was, in reality, a private family matter handled with haste to avoid the circus that had already begun to form outside the hospital walls. The medical truth of Tupac Shakur is that he was a human being of flesh and bone, susceptible to the same laws of physics and biology as anyone else. The myth of his invincibility was a byproduct of his incredible charisma and the power of his words, but the autopsy report provides the grounding reality. It tells a story of a young man who died of preventable violence, whose body bore the scars of a life lived at a pace that few could survive. Reflecting on his legacy, we see a man who became more powerful in death than he was in life. The tragedy of his medical end is the loss of what he might have become had his body been allowed to heal, both physically and psychologically. He remains a symbol of the contradictions of the American experience, the poet and the warrior, the victim and the icon. His death serves as a somber reminder of the fragility of life and the lasting impact of trauma. By looking at the clinical facts, we strip away the layers of gossip and return to the humanity of the man himself. We invite you to reflect on the reality behind the rumors and to consider how the medical truth of his end changes your perception of his life. How do we reconcile the legend with the human? Vulnerability revealed on the examiner's table? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this investigative look into the facts valuable, please subscribe for more deep dives into the lives and legacies that shaped our world.